Okay, let's do this. Hi, my name is Maris Kreisman, and I'm so thrilled to welcome you tonight to another excellent virtual event at McNally Jackson. If you go to mcnallyjackson.com and look at our events calendar, you'll see all the amazing writers and programs we're hosting in the coming weeks. Please keep an eye on the site or subscribe to our newsletter to hear more about what's coming up soon. There will be time at the end of tonight's conversations for your questions. So start thinking about them now, and you can use the Zoom chat function to submit any questions you have, and we'll get to them towards the end of the evening. We're glad that even though we can't all be in the same room at the moment, we're still able to host events during this difficult time. As we've weathered the pandemic and reopened all 4 of our locations for browsing and shopping, indie bookstores like ours still need more support. And so if you enjoy free events like this one and want us to keep hosting more of them, please buy books from us. Throughout the evening, I'll post links in the chat to buy Nicole's book from McNally Jackson. Her colleagues at the New York Times had this to say about "This is how they tell me the world ends." Perlroth gives a fast-paced account of the US government's digital vulnerability, how it has been exploited, and why the stakes couldn't be higher. I am delighted and slightly terrified to welcome Nicole and celebrate her book launch. Nicole is an award-winning cybersecurity journalist for the New York Times, where her work has been optioned for both film and television. She's a regular lecturer at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and a graduate of Princeton University and Stanford University. She lives with her family in the Bay Area, but increasingly prefers life off the grid in their cabin in the woods. And joining her tonight is Elizabeth Harris, who covers books and publishing for the New York Times. A Times reporter since 2009, she has covered education, retail companies for the business section, and New York politics and the arts. Welcome to both of you, and let's go.
All right, well, thank you very much for having us. So Nicole works, I think, with every reporter in the newsroom sometimes because every industry gets hacked. So I've worked with her a couple of times on different beats, but I was lucky enough to work with her recently because there's this very strange phishing attack targeting unpublished manuscripts in the book world, but no one seems to be pirating the manuscripts or even blackmailing anyone or selling them in any way. So it's this totally strange mystery as to why. And I loved this story. Nicole, did you love this story?
I did. And I will say, Liz is a great reporter because she's persistent, because she called me around the election when I was covering threats to the election. And she said, I'm pretty sure that there is some kind of spear phishing hacking campaign going on in the publishing world. And I remember thinking, like, what industry is not seeing spear phishing and hacking right now? This can wait. But really, like, Liz stuck with this story, and it turns out that there is one person or maybe a group of people we still don't know. And Liz led the story and wrote this terrific story about someone who's behind these mysterious spear phishing emails that has been successfully pillaging all these unpublished book manuscripts. So stay tuned for our next venture into who is doing this.
And I called Nicole like right before the election about this, and she didn't laugh at me, which was really nice of her. So that was good because she was a little busy, but that's okay. Let's see. So let's talk about your book. Let's see, which I loved, by the way. When did you decide to write the book, and how long did it take you?
Well, I decided around 2012. There were a lot of hacking books coming out. And a lot of them were by male authors, and a lot of them were citing my stories in the footnotes. And it got to this point of, why don't I write a book? It just seems like this really intimidating project. But I thought maybe I could write a book. And then I got pulled into this project at the New York Times, where we were given access to some of the Snowden documents. And it was sort of a funny story because one of the preconditions for us getting access to this trove of NSA documents was they had mandated that we work out of a room without windows. And as Liz knows, and if anyone in Manhattan knows, if you've ever walked by the Times headquarters, it was designed by Renzo Piano as this model for full transparency. So every floor, every conference room, is encased with floor to ceiling glass. And really the only rooms that didn't have windows were bathrooms and Arthur Sulzberger, our publisher's storage closet. So for about 3 months, I would have to forgo my devices, go into this storage closet and pour through these documents. And one of the things that kept jumping out to me was these littered references to one, a backdoor into pretty much every piece of software we use, whether it was your iPhone or Android or Facebook messages or Cisco routers and switches. And then it made these littered references to third parties, to commercial partners, to malware developers, to our security partners. And I had always heard these murmurings that there was this gray market for hackers who could find vulnerabilities in our code, for instance, a way to get into your iPhone software so they could read your text messages or turn your camera on without you knowing about it. And they would sell these to government agencies. And I'd heard there was a market, but no one ever wanted to talk about this. And what I was seeing in the Snowden documents seemed to confirm these rumors I'd been hearing for a long time. So that set me off on this 7-year journey where I tried to get to the bottom of this market for cyber vulnerabilities, to understand the history of this market, who started this market, who the brokers were who or the go-between guys between hackers and government agencies, whether this market had spread abroad, where it was spreading, what governments were using these tools, how they were using them, and what the stakes were for Americans in terms of our own security. So that's what I did. It took me 7 years. I mean, I wasn't writing every single day. I had a baby and got married and moved a couple times, got a couple of bad cases of writer's block, but finally the book is out, and I really tried to write a very character-driven account of the zero-day market, which was the market for cyber vulnerabilities.
I love the scenes in the book of you extremely pregnant, walking into these places that really don't want you there, and this very pregnant Nicole is just yeah, love it. Let's see. And I mean, so as you say, the book is all about gray markets and hacking, and there's all sorts of spying involved and espionage, and it reads like a spy novel, and it's a big reporting challenge, right, that you want to write a book about something that no one wants to talk about. And so how do you address that? What kind of challenges does that present, and how do you work through them?
So yeah, this was a market no one wanted to talk about, because in this market, the biggest customers are government agencies who see a lot of espionage potential in finding a way into your iPhone or finding a way into Windows software, which we all use, whether we know it or not. So governments aren't regulators, they're the biggest clients in this market. And a lot of these programs over the years have been classified. If there's any record of any of these transactions with hackers, usually it's worded, we, the Air Force, or we, the Pentagon, purchased software from this small team of, boutique contractor you've never heard of. And so just contracts weren't going to do it. So I knew I really had to get people to talk to me. And that was a big ask in this industry, because before I started the book, there had been one story. It was in Forbes magazine. It was actually a friend of mine who wrote it, Andy Greenberg, had written this story about one of these brokers for cyber vulnerabilities. His name's the Gruck. He's on Twitter. He has 100,000 followers or something. He's an influencer. And the Gruck agreed to an interview. And not only did he agree to an interview where he basically said, yes, I buy these vulnerabilities from hackers, I sell them to governments. He talked about just how much money could be made in this trade. Hackers can make as much as $1 million for a single way into your iPhone, to take over your iPhone. But he also posed for a photo next to a giant duffel bag of cash.
As one
And
does.
later, yes, as one does. Later, he would say that he thought he was speaking off the record, but he posed for the photo. And he's the South African. He lives in Thailand. And I heard that the Thai police visited him after this article. Basically, every government who read that article stopped doing business with him, because who wants to do business with someone who's going to talk to the press about this kind of business? And the other thing is, I should step back and say what a zero day is. A zero day is just a flaw in, let's say, your iOS iPhone software that Apple doesn't know about. And as if I find it, if I'm a hacker and I find it, I can sell it to the government. I can get $1 million as long as I agree not to tell anyone about it. Because the minute I tell someone about it, Apple finds out, they roll out a patch, they send it to your software update, you run your software update, it's not worth anything anymore. So no one wants to talk about a market in code that is secret code that once it gets out, it gets patched. So what I did was what, most of us do for any story, which is just find out what's out there publicly and just try and peel things back from there. And I found this company that was started in Virginia, and it was the first company really on the record to see value in purchasing these zerodays from hackers. And they were doing it for defensive reasons. They figured that if they could, get an early heads up on some of these vulnerabilities, they could sell that as intelligence to banks, to government agencies who don't do espionage, and then help them with a workaround, and they would give them something really unique. And I went back and talked to the people who started this company, and they said this worked for them for a few years, but suddenly there was sort of this change, and hackers who were willing to sell their zero day to this company, iDefense, for $500 or even like $100, were now demanding $50,000 for that same zero day, or $100,000. And the company was sort of like, what is happening here? The most we've ever paid for one of these is $10,000. Like suddenly these hackers are like getting greedy. What is going on? And then it started to make sense when the CEO started getting these phone calls from these people I originally describe in the book as mystery callers, who started calling him up and saying, hey, that zero day that you just bought for $500, we'll pay you $150,000 if you give that to us and you don't tell your customers. And more importantly, you don't tell the software manufacturer so it doesn't get fixed. And he started getting more and more of these calls. And ultimately, I mean, talk about profit margins. That would have been a very lucrative business. I probably would have taken it. No, I'm just joking. But he realized he'd be inherently working against his customers, and he'd be inherently working against security. He would be leaving these systems more vulnerable. So he said no, but he basically relayed this story to me. And he said whatever was happening in this government market was clearly wiping out their business. So he ended up selling the company and moving along. But I went and met with one of the people who had called him. And that is one of the people in the book. I actually had to change his name because he would only agree to speak with me on the condition I change his name. But he essentially walked me through this underground market for zero days. And he said that in the 90s, US government agencies really realized the potential for espionage from these zero days. And so they started paying hackers to turn these zero days over to them and never tell a soul. And those early stories were insane. They had to pay these guys in cash because they didn't want to leave a trace of these transactions. They would often work with these murky middlemen who would go over to Eastern Europe, where there were a lot of hackers who had, great technology education, but limited job prospects, who were willing to develop these zero days into zero-day exploits, the actual code you could use to exploit them. And they'd go over there with these duffel bags of cash and pay these guys like $100,000 or $150,000 for a zero-day bug, bring it back to their offices, develop it into code that they would sell to the Pentagon or to a lesser extent law enforcement agencies. And that was their business for a long time. And that was all gravy at the time, because in the 90s, we were all still using different software. Like in China, they were using Huawei. We were using Cisco. In Iran, they were using something else. In Russia, they were using something else. But the problem is when we all started using the same software, when we all started using iPhones and Android phones and Microsoft Windows and Siemens software for our industrial systems, when they found a zero day in those systems, they were inherently leaving Americans and American businesses and American infrastructure vulnerable. So the book really explores how this got started and when that moral hazard arose and where things went from there, which was downhill.
I like the duffel bags of cash theme in your book. That's very compelling. I didn't get one, unfortunately. So that's really interesting. I mean, sort of the moral hazard aspect of this. I mean, there's a lot in the book about sort of the responsibility and sort of how governments, the responsibility of governments to their citizens and to other people and all of that. It's also the responsibility of individual hackers and how sort of someone who figures one of these things out and who they're willing to sell it to and how that impacts thousands and thousands of people that the hacker will never meet and all that. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of the, kind of the moral questions in the book?
Well, one of the interesting things is just exploring the definition of a hacker. We all think a hacker is kind of a bad guy in a hoodie. But what I learned was, hackers really are just these tinkerers. And for a long time, they would poke and prod at the software. And when they found holes in these systems in the 90s and the early 2000s, there was no real way to alert the technology companies that they had these problems in their software. And often when they could find someone at a Microsoft or Sun or HP or something, often the gut knee-jerk reaction to someone pointing out problems in their products was to say, stop poking around our products and don't call back. And more often than not, they would get a call from someone's general counsel. So the technology companies really saw no value in what the hackers were doing. And on the other hand, I learned the government saw immense value in what the hackers were doing. And all of this was fundamentally leaving us more insecure. That's changed a bit now that we've had these big attacks. In Google's case, Google was hacked by China in 2009, and that really opened up their eyes to the fact that they weren't just defending their customers from everyday cyber criminals. They had to actually increase their security to the point where they could fend off a nation state attack. And they could no longer afford to ignore vulnerabilities in their products if they were going to do that in any kind of meaningful way. So they started paying hackers small bounties, nowhere near what the government will pay, but they started paying them bounties. And that sort of helped change the moral calculus for hackers, because suddenly they did have a way to be recognized for their work. They weren't going to get the same paycheck as they would get from government agencies, but at least they could sleep at night knowing that zeroday wasn't going to be used by some government to spy on an activist or a journalist or hijack a water treatment facility one day. So, it was really interesting too. I mean, I went down to Argentina for the book. And I went there because I'd heard that there are a lot of zero-day exploit developers in Argentina, which seemed really counterintuitive. So I wanted to go down and see it for myself. But what was interesting is, Argentina has a lot of import and export controls on their technology. So when I was down there, there's no Amazon Prime in Argentina. If they wanted to get an iPhone, they were going to have to pay something like $3,000 for it, or they were going to have to smuggle it in from the United States. So to get access to all these great tools and toys we all now have on our iPhone and take for granted, they really had to hack or learn how to hack to get access to these things. And so culturally, it created this entire culture of hackers in a way. And they became known for being some of the best hunters for these vulnerabilities and coders in terms of finding ways to develop them. And so I went and met with some of them, and I asked one of them a really stupid question, which was, so, if you find this flaw and the way to exploit it, like, will you only sell this to a good Western government? And they said, Nicole, you need to reframe that question, because last time I checked, the country that bombed another country into oblivion wasn't Iran or China, it was the United States. And here in Argentina, we actually don't think that highly of the United States. They help enabled our dirty wars and despots and the Argentina military. So no, we will not give a zero-day to the United States over Iran or China. In fact, all we do is if someone comes here with a bag of cash from Ghana or Iran, or the
Bag of
United States,
cash,
we just
bag of cash.
bag of cash. You
Mhm.
weigh the bag of cash and then you sell them your 0 day. And that was just a big eye opener for me, that this market has drifted elsewhere, that, I went into this wanting to explore the ethics of it,
Mm.
but in a lot of cases, there are no ethics.
Right.
There's a market for our vulnerability, and it gets sold to the highest bidder. And, at the end of the day, the people who are losing in this market is all of the rest of us.
And there was a moment that really struck me about sort of with the way some in the federal government thought of their own responsibility. There was something with the Toyota. Can you recount that one?
Yes. So in 2016, someone, we don't even know who they are, they appeared on Twitter. They called themselves the Shadow Brokers. They claimed to have hacked the NSA, which was unbelievable at first, but then slowly but surely they started dribbling out the NSA's zero-day exploits and code. Essentially, the NSA's crown jewels that they had been using for years to hack into firewalls, communications, Windows systems. They were all just dumped online.
Mhm.
And what happened next was, about a month later, North Korean hackers picked up that code and used it in an attack on, and the only reason I first found out about it is I got a call that hospitals in the UK were being held up with a cyber attack. And then it also boomeranged out to businesses and universities, and it ended up getting, fortunately, the North Koreans are a little bit sloppy with their code. So they had baked in some mistakes, and someone was able to use those against them to neutralize the attack. But then a month later, Russia picked up the same NSA hacked tools and used them on an attack on Ukraine that boomeranged around the world. It hit Cadbury chocolate factories in Tasmania. It hit FedEx. It caused something, hundreds of millions of dollars in damages at Pfizer. Merck was hit, and they actually had to, it held up their vaccine production. So that year, 2017, they had to tap into the CDC's emergency supplies of vaccines. So it was as bad as it gets. It was the most destructive, costly attack in history. But what I wanted to know was, did the NSA feel that they bore any responsibility for these attacks, for essentially not just hoarding vulnerabilities in Microsoft Windows, which is what was used to enable these attacks, but I'd found out they'd held on to it for 5 years. And, this is a system, this is software that we all rely on, not just for our communications, but increasingly Windows appears in our power plants, our water treatment facilities, our air traffic control. A lot of it runs on Windows. And so I wanted to know if the NSA bore any responsibility or if they felt any guilt over this. And so I was able to interview Mike Rogers, who had just left the NSA. He was their NSA director. And I asked him, do you lose any sleep at night over those attacks? And he said, I sleep just fine. And I said, well, do you feel like you bear any responsibility for them, for losing the NSA's hacking tools or hoarding these vulnerabilities for so long, and then seeing the wreckage they've caused Americans and American businesses? And he said this thing about a Toyota truck. He said, if Toyota makes a truck and someone else comes along and bolts a bomb onto it and rams it into a group of people, does Toyota bear any responsibility for that? And it was just a really interesting analogy, in that, to me, it felt so defensive. And it was clear to me that no, there was no guilt around any of these attacks at the NSA. And when I relayed the analogy to Microsoft later, which was furious that the NSA had held on to these holes in its code and only told them at the last minute, and by then it was too late, these attacks happened shortly after that. They said, that is the worst analogy I've ever heard, because they're not bolting a bomb onto the truck. These tools are bombs. These 0 days can be used to take out the power, and Russia has used them to take out the power in Ukraine. They can be used to, hop into our drinking supply, into our government's IT networks. Like these, in the wrong hands, these are very dangerous weapons, essentially. And so that's the Toyota story.
It's a good story. Well, so I want to ask you something I've been personally curious about for years. So people must try and spy on you constantly, right? I mean, how do you navigate that? I feel like you must be such a target. You probably pissed off all kinds of people who want to get into your phone. Like, what does that look like in your life?
I I've gotten really paranoid about this at times, especially when the Times got hacked by China. And I was fortunate enough to embed with our security team at the time and with the FBI and Mandiant, which is now a famous security company, but back then was a fledgling startup. And I did get really paranoid. I was living by myself. I was like in my early 30s. And I just remember one day my cable box in my bedroom was making a bunch of weird noise. And I was totally convinced that Chinese hackers were inside of it. And I ripped it out of the wall. And then the next morning, in like the morning light, this cable box ripped out on my floor. It just was like, no, no, no. I'm not going to turn into a tinfoil hat person. I am not going to be one of these people who just stare at everything and think it's, a spy. And I have purposely chosen to, not let these threats consume me, but at times they've gotten very real. Like our security team at the Times called me up one day and told me that someone was offering really good money to anyone who could hack my phone or my computer. I've gotten the Google, someone is trying to hack your account alerts and my social media accounts. And at one point when I was in Argentina working on the book, I had been careful enough to bring down a burner laptop. And actually the Times had provided it to me years ago and it never really worked. And I brought it down and I ended up just using pen and paper at the conference anyway, but I had left the laptop in the safe at the hotel I was at. And I came back my last night and it was, or maybe it was my second last night. I came in and the safe was open. The laptop was in a different position and all the cash I'd gotten, that I'd converted at the Cueva was still sitting on the table. So, someone had gone into my room. They'd even left the door open. So it wasn't like, it was almost like a message.
Yeah, that's not so.
And and I threw away the laptop. I didn't even bother trying to bring it back. And so things like that have happened. And they're always a reminder that I need to protect the most sensitive part of my life, which for me is my sources. If I'm meeting someone particularly sensitive, I just don't bring a device. I have one source where we just for a while just met up for a standing dim sum appointment on the first Tuesday of every month and didn't bring anything. And then I use Signal, the encrypted messaging app and that kind of thing. And I just don't click on links. But I also just make a point to not go overboard because I can't be ripping cable boxes out of my wall in the middle of the
night. Fair enough. Good balance. Well, another theme in the book, aside from the bags of cash, which is very important, in the book is sort of these wake-up calls that come every once in a while. And they start with typewriters at the American Embassy in Moscow in the 80s, right? So can you tell us about the typewriters and what happened there and then sort of walk us through some of the wake-up calls in the book?
Yes. So I tracked down this guy that most people will call the godfather of American cyber warfare. He was really responsible for a lot of the programs at the NSA and then the CIA that would search for vulnerabilities and ways to exploit them for our espionage operations. And he told me that what really kickstarted these programs was an attack at the embassy, the US Embassy in Moscow. He pointed me, they had just declassified these documents. So it was really helpful for the book. And it was a project codenamed Project Gunman. And essentially what happened was people at the embassy started to suspect that everything they said, did, even their unspoken communications, was being relayed to the Soviets. And we got a tip that from the French, who had discovered a bug in their teleprinters. And they said, we suggest that you look through your equipment, and I think you'll probably find a Soviet bug. So they commenced this really Herculean effort where they got every piece of machinery from the US Embassy back to Fort Meade, to NSA headquarters, under the Soviets' noses. They were really worried that the Soviets would come and intercept this equipment en route back to Fort Meade and remove whatever bug they had implanted. So they had to do this very carefully. It took them 100 days. And then it took them another 100 days to x-ray every last piece of equipment. And they started to really doubt that they were going to find anything. But they ended up finding a tiny little implant in the back coil of a typewriter. It was a magnetometer, which I hadn't even heard of until I wrote this book, but it was recording every tiny disturbance in the Earth's magnetic field, cataloging it. And then next to it was this little radio unit that was beaming the results to a radio unit that had been buried in the embassy's chimney. And by the time they had done an inventory of all their typewriters, they realized that the Soviets had been implanted in these typewriters for 8 years, siphoning every last unencrypted, communication from these secretaries' desks back to Soviet listening stations. And it totally freaked out the NSA, for lack of better words. And it basically opened their eyes to just how sophisticated Soviet exploitation programs had become. And it woke them up to the fact that if they did not pursue that kind of sophisticated digital exploitation, particularly as technology advanced, we were going to lose the Cold War. And so what essentially happened next is that kickstarted 2 decades worth of these programs at intelligence agencies to find every last vulnerability and every new piece of technology rolled out to market, ways to exploit it and use it on the adversary. Now, like I said, the problem is we all started using the same typewriters,
Right.
the proverbial typewriter. And so that created this moral hazard. And I would say, the next wake-up call was one of the biggest digital cyber intelligence feats of all time, which was in 2007, we, together with Israel, pulled off a cyber attack on Iran's nuclear facility. We called it Stuxnet after some clues in the code. But what it did was we hacked into an Iranian nuclear facility. We don't know who brought it in, but we know someone brought in a USB stick, plugged it into their system, allowed the code to spread until it eventually got to the rotors that spin the centrifuges that enrich Iran's uranium. And in some cases, the code was designed to spin these centrifuges out of control until they destroyed them. In some cases, it was designed to slow them down. And then on top of that, they had this whole Mission Impossible aspect of the attack, where anytime engineers looked at their systems, everything looked as if it was running perfectly smoothly, when in fact, they were destroying 1,000 uranium centrifuges. And that attack was just a stunning defeat. I mean, we set Iran's nuclear ambitions back years. We decimated 1,000 centrifuges. It even arguably got Tehran to the negotiating table when it came time to sit down to discuss the Iran nuclear deal. So short term, it was a complete success. Long term, it's been a total disaster, because what happened was the code, we don't know how, but it seeped out of Natanz nuclear facility. It started infecting systems all over the world. And security researchers detected it, picked it up, and it didn't take long for them to figure out that this was code that had been specifically designed to hit the industrial controllers at Iran's nuclear facility. And later we learned that this was a joint effort between the United States and Israel. And what happened from that attack is it opened up every other government's eyes to the potential for code to destroy an adversary's critical infrastructure, and also just the potential for code to spy on an adversary. And that attack was made possible by 7 zero-day exploits, several in Microsoft Windows and some in Siemens industrial software. And again, it came back to this moral hazard because Siemens systems, the bulk of Siemens industrial software isn't used in the Middle East, it's used in the United States. So, that attack had serious blowback potential. But, that was a wake-up call for other governments, and they started getting into the cyber zero-day market. They started paying hackers for these tools. The price governments were willing to pay for a way to hack into your iPhone or hack into Siemens industrial software has just only gone up, up, up as these governments are essentially outbidding one another for these tools. And it's created a lively broker trade. Brokers have just come out of the woodwork and they just post their prices online. They'll say, I'll pay you $1 million for a way to jailbreak an iPhone. And then more recently, these brokers have emerged that I learned, strictly supply Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and they're paying the highest prices. They're offering $3 million for the code that American brokers are only offering, $2 million for. So the market is very much out of our control. The other big wake-up call was the hack of the NSA's tools and the attacks that followed and hit American systems. And even then, I covered those for the front page of our paper, but I'm really glad I did the book because I think it's really hard for people to wrap their heads around exactly what that was and what responsibility the United States bore for those attacks. But it didn't stop anything. It didn't really change anything. And now we're facing two simultaneous wake-up calls. One, the Russian attack that we're calling SolarWinds because of the way they got in on government systems like the Department of Energy and our nuclear labs and the Department of Homeland Security, the very agency charged with keeping us safe. And what the Biden administration just inherited is IT systems it can't trust. And that is a major problem. And it could be months or years before we can confidently say we've kicked Russia out of our networks. And then the other one happened on Friday when someone, we don't know who, hacked into a water treatment facility in tiny Oldsmar, Florida, which no one had ever heard of outside Oldsmar in Tampa, but it's a small town, population 15,000. And a software engineer happened to be sitting at his computer and saw his cursor move around his screen and then didn't think anything of it because they let supervisors, miles away get into these systems to monitor them. But a couple of hours later, he saw someone actually go into the functions that control the levels of chemicals in the water and up the amount of lye, LYE, in the water from something like 100 parts per million to 11,000 parts per million, and quickly was able to cut off remote access. They caught this thing. But these are the systems we've been worried about with this moral hazard. This is a small town's water treatment facility that is remotely accessible through software. It doesn't have the security resources of a PG&E. And it was just one guy that happened to be sitting on the screen. And so we just keep having these like very close calls. Each attack seems a little deadlier than the last, but they're always these sort of near misses. Like, okay, Merck was able to still get its vaccine of, its Gardasil vaccines from the CDC. Oh, well, he did try and contaminate the drinking supply, but they caught it at the last minute. And so the reason I'm happy the book is coming out now is because I'm hoping we can start making changes now before we wait for that calamitous, world ending. It won't end the world, but it can turn off the power. It can contaminate our water. It can mess up air traffic control. And so that was the goal of the book.
So what it feels like there's, oh wait, does someone have a question? Should we take questions or do I get one more? Maris, what do you think?
One more. Go ahead.
Okay. It feels to me like there's a lot would be kind of intimidating about starting this project. I mean, writing any book is intimidating. There's the subject matter, the bags of cash, all of the things. I guess so I'm just curious about sort of you approaching this. What was the most intimidating part about this?
Okay, so this is dealing with like an invisible classified black market, but honestly, the most intimidating part was writing about these topics for a lay audience. Like, I really wanted to write about this topic, which is highly technical, for my mom. You know, I wanted my mom to read this book and know what I've been doing for the last 7 years.
Hi, Mom.
So, you know, that was hard. And the intimidating thing about that is you're inevitably going to piss off the experts. And there is no audience that is more hypercritical or passionate or has more easily bruised egos than people who work in information security. Like, I always wonder, like, I want to go out to lunch with our reporters in Israel covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and compare notes and find out who gets more shit on Twitter. Because these people, you know, anything that you dumb down in terms of describing what a zero day is and what a zero day exploit is, they will come after you like you've murdered their firstborn child. So I had those guys in my head. And I think that was actually the scariest part. I was much more scared of what the critics in information security, who were inevitably not going to be happy with a book written for the layperson, were going to say. But so far, it's been a good reception. I think there are people who are grateful that they have something they can give their moms to explain what they've been doing for the last few years. So it worked out.
Great. That's great. We have a question from Carol, who says, "This is a fascinating and terrifying wake-up call about zero days and the widespread potential for."
You sound a little underwater, Maris.
Oh,
now I can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. I mean, you can probably read it on the screen too. "This is a fascinating and terrifying wake-up call about 0 days and the widespread potential for cyber attacks. It makes old-fashioned espionage seem quaint. Is there any hope of getting this under control? How will this look in the next 5 to 10 years?"
It's, you know, first of all, I would say sometimes I felt silly writing a book with the title, "This is how they tell me the world ends," when climate change and disinformation were just had their foot on our throats. I live in California where the wildfires were really bad. And I was thinking, okay, now I really need to change the title. And then when the pandemic happened, it was like, oh, now they're really going to make me change the title. But fortunately, they let it ride.
It's a really good title.
Oh, thank you. Came to me in the shower, like all good ideas do.
Excellent.
But, you know, like climate change and like the pandemic, it is a sort of all hands on deck problem where it won't be solved unless we collectively, as a society, as businesses, as governments, make a decision to stop leaving ourselves more vulnerable. So, you know, at the individual level, it's those daily inconveniences that we all dread, like creating long different passwords for different sites and turning on two-factor authentication and not clicking on links from people we don't know. And at businesses, it means really designing code with hackers in mind. You know, they call it security by design, you know, testing your code before you roll it out into people's Teslas and power grid plants, you know. And then at the government level, it means stop leaving us more vulnerable. When you find a hole in Microsoft Windows and you have an urgent need to exploit it to track down the next bin Laden, okay, but don't hold on to it for 5 years until someone else has hacked it from your own network and used it back on us, on American businesses and American people. And so if there's any silver lining, I think it's right now we are dealing with this very, very horrible, pervasive Russian attack on our systems that leaves the new administration no choice but to take cybersecurity seriously. Biden has said that he will make it the priority. He squeezed $10 billion in cybersecurity funding into the new COVID recovery bill, or his proposed COVID recovery bill. And then he's nominated some smart women actually to lead some of their cybersecurity programs. So we're fortunately headed in the right direction, because after the last 4 years, anyone who was working on cybersecurity in government or thinking about these things was doing it in spite of the administration, not because of the administration. the heroes who locked down the election and made sure that it was not subject to foreign interference, got fired for it essentially, and did it sort of under cover of darkness. Now, it's going to be a major priority for this administration. So hopefully it's not going to change overnight, but at least now we are really focused on this issue. We have no choice but to focus on this issue. And I think people for a long time were resistant to security push by government. There was a bill at one point to identify critical infrastructure in the United States and to force the private operators of these water treatment facilities, et cetera, to meet certain standards. And if they didn't meet the standards, there would be penalties. That failed because lobbyists decided that was too burdensome for American businesses who operate this infrastructure. And so I think hopefully right now, I think the more awareness there is around these attacks, the more willingness there is to make these trade-offs for speed and convenience in the name of security.
Steve says, this is awesome, Nicole. You mentioned one factor that makes all of this possible is a handful of tech companies now run the vast majority of individual devices and larger systems. How does that inform your opinion about the consolidation of big tech companies versus a return to more diversification?
So I think this answer, hi, Steve. Steve's my old roommate in New York. I think that the answer is kind of counterintuitive, but the big tech companies can hire and have hired many intelligence agencies, essentially. I mean, if you walk into Google's security team, you're going to see people from NSA, from the NSA equivalent in the UK and Australia and Canada. They've really poached a lot of their best security people, and they have the budgets and the resources to monitor their systems for anomalous activity and attacks and protect their customers. So on the one hand, like, you are safer putting your data in the Amazon Web Services cloud than you are putting it on your little backend server in your office somewhere. On the other hand, it's a little bit disturbing, just as it is with our public discourse, that we are essentially leaving it to these major corporations, relying on them for our security. But it's just it's hard, But I trust my data more with Google than I do if I went and set up my own little server somewhere and tried to do it all on my own.
Emily has one last question that I think we'd all love to hear the answer to. Was there really not any hacking of the 2020 election? How is that possible?
It's such a good one. I think that fortunately, Chris Krebs, the guy who led the cybersecurity agency at DHS, did make a big push to get paper backups for our ballots, and kudos to him for doing that. He basically did it in spite of, like I was saying. Oh, sorry, did I lose you?
You are.
Oh, okay. He basically did it in spite of this administration, and at the end of the day, we were in these calls with his agency every couple hours, and they were saying, we're not seeing anything, we're not seeing anything. At the end of the day, they concluded it was just another Tuesday on the internet. And I found that totally unbelievable, because for the last year, it was clear all of these other actors had a lot of interest in trying to interfere in the election. But now we're learning that, at least in Russia's case, they weren't focused on our election. They were focused on breaking into our federal government. But, and my other take on Russia is interesting. What they wanted in 2016 was not necessarily to elect Trump so much as to so badly damage Hillary and to create so many divisions in our public discourse that her presidency would effectively be like neutered, And in 2020, when you look around, especially after the election, and you saw people outside the Philadelphia election ballot counting centers, you know, the heart of our democracy, yelling, "Stop the vote," and threatening election poll workers with death threats, it's like Russia didn't even have to do anything. We are in the exact position, you know, that visual alone is probably so far beyond Putin's wildest dreams. His work here was like done, you know, we've done it to ourselves. So, you know, that's sort of my take on that. But I think it's really interesting because when you talk to security experts, they hate that Chris Krebs was out there calling this the most secure election in history, because there is so much work to do to lock up our elections. We need to have hand-marked paper ballots. We need to have risk limiting audits. You know, we need to be doing these things. And I think they thought that by Chris Krebs saying this was the most secure election of all time, people would have the takeaway that, you know, the work is done, everything's secure, and we don't need to keep working to lock up our elections. So, you know, there's a lot more work to be done, and hopefully, you know, this administration, and I'll say, you know, the GOP was the one who was so resistant to any election security. Like when every election security bill essentially died on Mitch McConnell's desk. And when Kirstjen Nielsen, who was then the Homeland Security advisor, brought up election security at the White House, this is in the book, she was given the Heisman. They said, don't ever bring up election security with this president ever again. They just didn't want to hear it. And after the election, all of these conspiracy theories about the election being rigged and everything that happened after that, it was painful, but also I had to laugh watching Rand Paul go on Twitter, and he tweeted one day, you know what would have really helped is if we had had a way to audit small samples of ballots for irregularities, and then we would know to be able to go back if we found those irregularities and audit all of the ballots in that county. And it was like, Jesus, this is exactly what was in the bill that died on Mitch McConnell's desk. So it's interesting because now it's the GOP who's saying we need to study irregularities from the last election. We need, you know, better security. We need to make sure Dominion is, you know, a valid, you know, not Venezuelan or whatever the conspiracy theory says. So I do think, hopefully, you know, if there's any bright spot from this horrible, horrible place our country has been in, it'll be that we might see some bipartisan election security legislation. So, you know, that's one thing to follow. But thank you so much for all the questions. Was there another one, Maris, or are we good?
No, we're good. Thank you so much.
Okay.
It's been fascinating and terrifying and wonderful. And everyone should buy a copy of This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends if you haven't yet.
Bye, Nicole.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Liz. This was awesome.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.